Okay, so here's the question at hand. How do you create a form like this, and how do you put the 3D sketch together? So this is a kind of a stainless steel hook that goes inside of a plastic magnet hook cover in a way, kind of a body. It snaps into place. But the desire is to try to get a sweep feature on this thing. It's done by a sweep, and we need some sort of sketch element in the background. So as you know, a swept boss base needs to have a single sketch element in here, and it doesn't necessarily have to be co-planars. You can see, these three sections over here of that line are kind of co-planar, but these two aren't. And of course, you can go ahead and create a couple different planes to do this. For instance, we're looking at the front plane over here for those three features. And then for this portion over here, we're probably looking at a plane that would be parallel to the right, and that would be parallel to the right over here too, with the right going right down the middle. But you could do this instead of putting in all this complex geometry, 2D geometry, and eventually connecting it with a 3D sketch. It has to be a continuous sketch to do this. We could do this all by using a 3D sketch from the very beginning. So let's take a look at our base feature down here in the sketch that's driving it. If we go into that sketch, we can see what's in the background and how it's put together. So we start with the line up here. It's going to be a 1/2 inch line. It's going to be, we're going to be thinking about the triad down here. That line is going to be along the x-axis, so that's probably kind of a new little sketch relation. And that's that sketch relation over there. But that's similar to being like horizontal in the front plane. And as you know, when you're in a 2D sketch, you have a choice between horizontal and vertical. And the difference between those two and 3D sketching is that when you're in a 2D sketching environment, you only have horizontal and vertical, and that's usually determined by the orientation of when you begin to start sketching your model out. So if you think about it, like the top sketch, if you're sketching something out, doesn't necessarily, there is no really any vertical in the top plane. But it's how it's oriented on the screen when you begin to sketch. That's what makes that determination. So here in a 3D sketch environment, you can go in three different directions. So you can't automatically assign horizontal and vertical to it because you don't know what to assign for that third element is. So we use a triad down here, and we have what would be equivalent to a horizontal relation in here is going to be along the x. What would normally be a vertical relation in here is now going to be along the y. And the relationship that's coming out towards you is going to be along the z. So with that in mind, we're going to be putting this sketch together in a 3D sketch. And we're going to be choosing 3D sketch as an element up here, just like you would choose a plane. And we're going to go ahead and choose some of the elements associated that can be associated with a 3D sketch by going over here to our regular sketch elements that we have over here and being able to choose these sketch entities. So we could choose line, circle, spline, and some other ones. What we can't choose that you see in the background is going to be the ellipse, sketch text, straight slot, and the polygon command. And there's another limitation too with 3D sketching, is you don't have a lot of capabilities for mirroring or symmetry. So sometimes you have to put together some 2D sketch elements in here with a 3D sketch, but we're not going to be covering that here. We're just going to be doing straight 3D sketching, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, so let's go and rebuild this. We're going to go back and reference that in a minute. We're going to take a rollback bar and roll that back all the way to the top, and we'll talk about how to put this together. So we don't have to choose a plane in here when we go to the 3D sketch. Just want to go to the sketch tab up here. And if you don't have 3D sketch available up here in your command manager, what you want to do is you want to right click on the command manager and you want to go down to customize. And this might be temporary for the CAD lab computers. But what you want is commands. Going into commands is going to be a sketch command. So we're going to go down here to sketch. It should be the fourth element in. All you do is drag that and put that up here on your feature manager, or not your feature manager, but your command manager. You're going to drop that into place. Now I already have that up here, so I'm not going to put that in place. But once you get that up there, go ahead and go to the red X, and now we're ready to build this model. So what you want to do is go up here to the sketch tab in the command manager. Go over here to 3D sketch, and we're going to go to line, and we're going to begin to sketch this out. So one thing you notice here is that the cursor looks a little bit different. You have a pencil, what appears to be a pencil. You have a coincident relationship, which is kind of showing up on white there, which means it's going to be coincident to something, but we're not certain about what that might be. But it's also telling us that we're going to be sketching along the X, Y plane in a way. So that's kind of like, if you think about that, it's parallel to the front plane. So as we sketch this out, it's going to be on a plane that's going to be parallel to the XY plane as defined by the triad down here. Now we could take our tab key and try this. Take the tab key and tab it. And you'll notice that the orientation now changes too. Now it's YZ. Press it again, it's going to be ZX. And press it a third time, we go back to where we were before. Something else you notice over here too, right on top of the origin, is that we have kind of like an extra set of axes up here. And that's going to change too as we press the tab key. So it looks like an exaggerated origin over here with the two lines being equal, the red lines back here. And if you go to tab, now you can see that the orientation changes. So now it looks like we might be sketching on a plane that might be parallel to the YZ plane, equivalent to the front plane. And if we do that one more time, the ZX, now it looks like we're going to be sketching on a plane that might be parallel to the top plane. So again, back to the origin, that's what we want to do. So we're going to exaggerate this. We're going to keep the X, Y orientation, and we're going to sketch a line out here like that. So now that triad, or that what looks like an origin over here, changes, and it goes to where we started sketching that line. You'll notice as we approach this line over here, of what looks like to be the origin, that like mini triad, that symbol that we have over here, if we put it right on top of that line, it kind of snaps to that as we get closer to it. You'll notice that now we have a sketch relation right next to the cursor. It says it's going to be along the X. As we approach the other one over here, which is going to be along the Y. So we're going to get that sketch relation along the Y on that orientation, on that symbol. And if we go over here and sketch it out over in that direction, it's going to be along the X. So we're going to take advantage of that, and we're going to make that along the X. As we drop that into place, do escape, now we have our blue line. That line is going to be essentially on the very front of our front plane. Right now it isn't. If we spin that around and take a look at the origin, it's kind of below that a little bit. But if you right-click on that line, select midpoint, select the origin, now we're going to make that coincident. And yeah, we're going to try that one more time. How about if you just click on that line first? Click in the origin, we'll make that coincident. And then we can do the midpoint. So right-click over here, select midpoint, go to the origin. We're going to go ahead and select that and make that coincident too. 3D sketching can sometimes be a little tricky, but keep in mind there's a lot of 2D sketch operations that we put together in a 2D sketch environment that can be applied to the 3D sketch. But ultimately, as we move along in this model, we want to make sure it gets fully defined. So let's go ahead and start right off the bat. We're going to go ahead and put a 0.5 inch dimension on that. And now we have that in place. So now it's fully defined. We have a black line with a midpoint at the origin, and the two endpoints of that line are blue. So far, it's fully defined. Okay, so where do we go from here? I took a screenshot of our sketch that we had in the background, and we're going to go ahead and follow this. So, can't really see the cursor here. It's like a little black dot because I'm in the snipping tool. But along the top we have that 1/2 inch line. Eventually we're going to be putting in these two radius fillets in here, sketch fillets. But the next thing we want to do is put in some sketch geometry and go down here 0.9 inches down over here. And we're going to put in a sketch geometry down here, which is going to be, both of them are going to be center lines. And we're going to put a point down here too, if you can see where the cursor is. And we're going to go ahead and apply dimensions in here. The application of dimensions here in a 3D sketch environment is a little bit different, but you want to make sure you follow rules if you can. One of those rules is going to be that you want to make sure that you sketch or you take a dimension between a line and a point if you can. Going from a line to a line that might be perpendicular but maybe askew to it a little bit, it may not work as well. So think about 3D sketching as you have to put in some of that extra sketch geometry in order to get your model fully defined. So at this point we're going to do a center line. We're going to go down from that point. So look at the orientation of our symbol that's associated with the 3D sketching. And that's okay. We want to make sure we go down along the Y-axis. So we're going to pick up that along the Y, or parallel to the Y relationship in here. Kind of stretch it out a little bit because it's going to be a little bit longer than 0.5 inches down here that we have there. Then we're going to put a line in here originating from that line over here, and we want to this time make it come out towards the Z. We want it to come out towards us. So we're going to go ahead and press the tab key, make sure we have the Z axis selected as one of the axes, and we're going to sketch out a line coming off in that direction. And if you can, pick up that along the Z orientation, and now you can see what we have. So as we rotate this around, now you can kind of see that 3D sketch as it exists in our model so far. So let's put in that dimension, 0.9 dimension. We're going to go between that line up here and this point. We can't really pick this line here. Not going to let us do that very easily. But we can pick this point over here. And now we can make that 0.9. So far everything's black except for the two endpoints of these center lines. And now we can move on a little bit. So next thing we want to do is we want to put if you actually have the center line in here, it doesn't really intersect this line in here. You probably want to put a point in here. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and trim entities, or maybe take this line and extend that out a little bit. Of course, if you erase that line, it's going to erase that dimension. But something else we could do too is we could take that center line and sketch that out. You want to make sure you do that along the Z, as we did before. Then we take perhaps the midpoint of that line. This line over here as an alternative. Go ahead and make that coincident. And now we can put a point down here. We can't really do the intersection down here. It's not going to let us do that. But if we exaggerate this and put a point over here, then take that point with that coincident relationship on that line along the Z, and go to this line along the Y, make that coincident too. Now we have a point down here. And now we can dimension between that point too. So in other words, if these endpoints of these lines are not convenient in order to pick, between like maybe this point and that line up here, if it's not convenient to do that, that's not really the dimension we're looking for. What we have down here is a point that's along the Z-axis, and this line over here, let's try that again. I don't think it was going in the right direction, but we're going to go between this point and this line up here that we sketched before. Now we're going to make that 0.9. So now that's fully defined except for the endpoints of that center line and the endpoint of this center line down here too. And now we're ready for the next step. Okay, so referring back to our image that we took of the previous sketch, what we want to do is we want to put in an arc down here. And we don't really have a line in here yet that goes from the top down to the bottom, from that half-inch line up here to the point down here where we establish that 0.9 dimension. So I think what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting in a circle. And then we're going to put in a diameter in that circle, which is going to be twice what the radius is. Then we're going to go ahead and put this line over here on the side, which is going to be tangent to that. We're going to put that angle in there. Then we're going to go ahead and trim out part of that circle. I'll show you how the trim tool behaves in the 3D sketch. So let's try this. Let's go ahead and put in that circle. And you want to make sure we have the proper orientation of the circle. You want to make sure that since we're going to be sketching on something that's going to be resembling a plane, and you want to make sure you put it in on the YZ plane over here. So we're going to sketch this out roughly in this area, center point circle. And I don't want to pick up any relationships with the lines in there so far. And we're going to go ahead and click in the circle on that line. We're going to make that tangent. The circle and this line over here going off in the Z direction, we're going to make that tangent. Now we're going to put a dimension on that of 0.3. Once we do that, that should be black and that should be ready to go. So let's go ahead and put in a line in here, as we mentioned before. And we're not necessarily going to go off in the same. We want to make sure that we do it. We sketch that line out, which would be parallel to the YZ axis. But now we're going to be following in a different direction. We're not going to be going along one of the directions like along the Z or along the Y. We're going to go off in a different direction up here. So we're going to go and drop that in place. Take that line in that arc, and we're going to make that tangent to it. And now we're going to establish some dimensions in that. So it's going to be a 40-degree dimension between that line and that line over here. We're going to make that 40. Now we want to make sure, and that's almost fully defined except for the endpoint of that line. We would define the endpoint of that line by putting in a center line between that point and this down here. So whatever you might be sketching, you might have different pieces of reference geometry you're going to be putting in here. For this model, we want to make sure that the distance between that point and this line is going to be 1/4 of an inch. And I'm putting in this extra geometry in here. So all we have to do to be safe with that is we're going to put in a dimension right in that line. We're going to make that 1/4 of an inch. Now conceivably, we can go from the endpoint of that line right down to this down here. And putting a dimension between a point and another line is a good dimension. A point between a point, not a good dimension, because it can still, as I mentioned in class, it can still rotate around those points. And sometimes you don't get exactly what you're looking for. So with that in place, now we're going to go ahead and put in a line right on top of our reference geometry between this point down here and between that circle, or maybe on that line. And we want to make sure that that line is along the X. So it kind of turned blue. Maybe I was a little bit quick when I was trying to drop that line in place, but we can correct that. If we click an outline itself, now we can force along the y-axis. In fact, you look over here in a properties manager over here, it actually is defining for us that it's suggesting, because it's got bold text to it, that align the axis along the y-axis might be a good choice. And I agree with that. So if we do that, now that line turns black. So last thing we need to do is go to trim entities. So remember, in a 2D environment, if we take our left cursor and kind of drag that around, we'll get a trail right next to the cursor, and everything that crosses that trail will get deleted. A little bit different in the 3D sketch environment. Now it's going to automatically delete portions of that sketch entity between other sketch entity references. So if we click on that circle, you can see it's kind of orange, kind of highlights a little bit. And if we click on that, it's going to get rid of that portion of the circle. So to be consistent with our drawing that we have, we're going to go ahead and take that diameter dimension and delete that. Of course, that makes other elements beyond that black line over here, that vertical black line, or the Y black line. Kind of makes those blue, not fully defined, but we're going to go back to that arc and we're going to make that 0.15. I should define that. So now we almost have half of this. We're going to save that radius dimension over here until a little bit later, but let's see what we put together so far. So again, I'm sorry about the little dot on the snipper over here, the snipping tool. But we have the half-inch line up here, kind of a square corner up here in the upper right-hand corner. We have that line that goes down, which is going to be along the Z, or along the Y, I should say. And we have that circle that was sketched out, which is now an arc on the plane. It would be parallel to the YZ plane, and that line, which is going to be tangent to it, 1/4 of an inch tall, 40 degrees from that, and then with a radius dimension of 0.15. And now we're going to build the other side, and we're going to build the other side in a very similar manner. Okay, so the other side, let's take a look at the other side. So we have our half-inch dimension on top for that line on top. And we're going to go down very similar to what we have on the right-hand side, but everything's going to be the same, except for this dimension over here, the 0.45-inch dimension over here. That's going to be a little bit different. So we're going to make that, it's going to be half as long, but everything else is going to be in place. Now, conceivably, we could take over here this arc and that line, we can make those equal to each other and parallel and stuff like that. Sometimes that works, and we're going to try that here in just a moment. So, same thing we did before. We're going to take that center line. We're going to go down. We're going to make sure that's along the Y. And then from there, we can take a line over here and bring that out along the Z. And remember, tab it if you need to do that. Change your orientation. So we're going to drop that in place. And now we're going to put a dimension in here between that point and this line up here. We're going to make that 0.45. So kind of like what we did before, let's go ahead and rotate that around a little bit so we can see what we're doing. We're going to go to the center circle. And we want to make sure we have the orientation of YZ here and sketch that circle out. So again, a tangent relationship there. Oop. Let's go ahead and bring that back. Control Z. Yeah, we didn't really quite have that in the orientation we're looking for. So let's go ahead and drag that over here, which might be a little bit more friendly. And now let's try that. And we're going to make that tangent. We want to make sure you have that tangent on the right side. We're going to make this tangent too. And now we're going to put that dimension of 0.15, but we could conceivably take this and make those equal to each other, which works so far, which is good. And we're going to put in that tangent line. We're going to make sure we still have the YZ orientation on that. So sketch that line out. Now we're going to take these two, and yeah, if we did that right, we have that tangent relationship, which is good. And this time, as a little bit different from last time, we could take a dimension between that point and this line and make that 1/4 of an inch. And by doing that, it's still blue. So why is that blue? Well, let's see. Sometimes you can take that, the endpoint of a line, both in a 2D sketch and a 3D sketch environment, move it around and see what you need to do. And what we're missing here, which is pretty obvious, we need to put in that 40-degree dimension. So between those two elements, we're going to make that 40 degrees. And now that's black and it should be ready to go. So again, we're going to take a line down here from that point down here to the circle. Let's go ahead and exaggerate that a little bit. And now let's go ahead and take our trim tool and trim out the tail of that line. So remember, we can't really take that trace in here and cut that out. We're just going to have to press on it. And now we'll put that in place. So now that turned blue. So let's go ahead and take an endpoint and see what we need to do. So it kind of lost that along the Y direction in here. So we're going to go ahead and click an outline like we did before. Go to along the Y, and that should be black. So let's go ahead and trim this out. Let's go ahead and trim out this. And that should be the same as that. So everything's black. It's almost ready to go, except for our fillets on top. But let's try this. We've already made that equal. Why not take out this dimension in here and make this line over here and that line equal to each other too? And see what happens. So that works out. Sometimes that doesn't. Sometimes that doesn't. Sometimes this will actually make that turn blue. If that's the case, then you're probably going to have to define this the way you would normally. But I think if we took out this 1/4 inch dimension, let's see what happens. That happens there too. So if we take that endpoint of that line and stretch out, see what that happens. See what happens with that. So it's got a little bit of flexibility. One way we could probably fix that is take that line and this line and maybe make those parallel to each other. So a lot of different ways of trying to establish this, trying to put this all together with as few in a way of dimensions as possible is always a good way. But sometimes when you make these relationships in here, it could fail on you, and a lot of the lines that were fully defined before may turn blue. But just remember, your default setting is always going to be to use the dimensions that we have down here and apply them to this element over here too, on that side. So let's go ahead and put in, finish this up. Let's put in our sketch fillet. It's going to be 0.10. So we're going to go ahead and stick with the default setting. Now, because we have a midpoint relationship in here, when we click on that line, it's going to say that we have an equidistant relationship in here because of that midpoint relationship. And if we continue on with that, it might goof up our model a little bit. It doesn't say goof up, but it may cause some errors. But we're going to go to yes over here. And if we make that symmetric again by going over to this side, still going to give us that potential error in here. We're going to go to yes over here too. If we go to the green check mark, now it puts that into place. So that looks fully defined and ready to go. So there's our 3D sketch, almost ready for our Swept Boss based feature. And we're going to do that next. So go to the green check mark, and we'll be right back. And by the way, before we do leave this, it says it's not fully defined, but I think if we rebuild that, now it gets fully defined, and it's sitting there in our feature manager tree. Okay, so this part is actually going to be pretty easy. Remember, with the Swept Boss Space feature, you need to have an embedded sketch. His sketch is already done. You can't be in the sketch environment to do that. So, and we already have our material defined, which is going to be our ANSI AISI 316 annealed steel bar, stainless steel. And now we're going to go ahead and put our Swept Boss Space feature in here. So if we go to Features, Swept Boss Space, we're going to do this. We're going to go ahead and do Circular Profile. We're going to define the diameter of our profile, which is going to be 0.12 inches. And then we're just going to go over here and pick the path for that. Once we do that, get that in place. Green check mark. We're going to go ahead and finish this up by putting in our fillet. And the fillet is going to be half of the default setting, which is 0.05. And we're just going to go ahead and click on this edge and then this edge. And that should be ready to go. So your 3D model might be a little bit different, but that's kind of a primer in regard to 3D sketching. And how you do 3D sketching, maybe some of the tips and tricks, and maybe some traps too associated with that. But that's a simple 3D sketch, and it's a little bit easier to put together than trying to do a lot of 2D sketches in the background, and then putting that together ultimately as a 3D sketch. If you understand some of the basics with 3D sketching, this gives you a good head start.